Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence to the Climate Assembly. Climate and nature have co-evolved for the last 4 billion years, and they're not going to stop doing that anytime soon. And so we have a triple challenge. We need to transition to a net zero economy, which will require major changes in the use of land and sea. We also need to adapt to climate change that's already locked into the system, which will require major changes to the use of land and sea. And we need to improve the state of nature by tackling the main drivers of biodiversity loss, including, of course, climate change. And the state of nature is all about how we use the land and sea. And we need to do all three of these things over the same period of time from now onwards, and on the same areas of land and sea, raising a vital question about the scale of that integration and the benefits that flow from those choices. This slide builds up to show just why nature and land are so important in the transition to net zero. In a net zero economy, all emissions need to be offset by greenhouse gas removals or sinks. These two columns show the Scottish greenhouse gas emissions for 1990, the baseline, and 2017, and looking forwards to 2030, and this column has now shrunk to meet the statutory 75% reduction target for 2030. Just to make that a little bit more challenging, from 2022, wetlands and peatlands will be added to the UK greenhouse gas inventory, and a further 6 to 10 megatons of CO2 equivalent, because degraded peatlands are net sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And at that point, about 30% or almost a third of the inventory will be concerned with the land. And that portion will only increase as other sectors decline, so that by 2045, maintaining a net zero economy forevermore will be about how we use the land. And so nature and the land are essential in the transition to net zero and maintaining it. And the other point I wanted to make from this slide is that for farming and forestry and all uses of the land, mitigation, adaptation, and state of nature are all the same thing. We can't put a spade in the ground without doing all of those three things at the same time. So, of course, reducing fossil fuel emissions is an essential component of transitioning to net zero, but it won't get us all the way there. We also need to use the land to protect natural stocks of carbon in our peatlands and ancient woodlands and marine sediments, for example, and enhance those through habitat restoration of woodlands and grasslands, hedges and blue carbon. And together they amount for about 50% of the effort required from the land, with the other half in other land uses, especially farming, forestry and all forms of development, to be, as far as possible, carbon sinks, including, of course, their soils. All of those uses also need to be diverse in order to be resilient to the pests, disease, floods, fires, and drought that we can expect to see more of in a changing climate. As the Climate Change Committee have pointed out, we will also need to capture and store carbon from power plants and such like. But the more that we act on all of that sooner, the less we will have to rely on so-called negative emission technologies and geoengineering, because interfering in planetary scale ecosystems tends not to end well. So here are some examples of Scotland's carbon-rich habitats. I guess the main point to note from this is that these numbers are much larger collectively and individually than the current Scottish greenhouse gas inventory on a yearly basis. The figure for marine sediments is just for the top 10 centimeters of sediments, and we're currently working to figure out what that means for management of the seabed. For peatlands, the Climate Change Plan update signals a significant increase in the 2030 target of 250,000 tonnes restored in Scotland. The UK Climate Change Committee in its sixth carbon budget recommends almost 50% restored by 2030, but it's important to note that the 250,000 equates to more or less a third of peatlands restored in Scotland, but it's not a linear game. There are some peatlands that are easier to restore than others, and others where we get more carbon bangs for our buck, and we'll be working with Scottish Government and other stakeholders to clarify where our efforts should be focused initially. All of that will require both public and, importantly, private finance, and the latter through the massive increase in expansion of carbon markets underpinned by the woodland and peatland codes. And there are huge opportunities here for skills and jobs in order to get this work done. We have loads of great examples of nature-based solutions. Some of them are identified here, but the key point here is that we need to move these to a landscape scale, integrated with other uses of the land, working across catchments for multiple benefits. They need to be created, but they also need to be maintained if they're going to provide multiple benefits over time, diversifying the skills and jobs in rural economies and for resilient communities. For multiple benefits, we need to work with a full diversity of people from the outset, and we're strongly supportive for the emphasis on collaboration and cooperation in the Climate Change Plan update, guided, for example, by the place principle, aligning effort across organisations to maximise the benefits from our resources. We also need to move from considering the aggregate costs and benefits associated with choices about how we use the land and sea to the distribution of those costs and benefits. And that comes back to the diversity of people involved in those decisions and what interests are at play. So this transformation in governance is going to be a vital component of transforming how we use the land and sea within and between different uses for a net zero economy.